Welcome to Science Frontiers, a space for discussions in the frontier areas of science and technology. I am your host, Vinay Panda. Bioethics is a branch of study that deals with ethical, social, and legal issues in life and medical sciences research. It has a much broader connotation than medical ethics, as it deals with results from different areas of life sciences, including from recombinant DNA technology, reproductive rights, and human longevity. The discipline has evolved as a much greater pace due to the advancement of science and the use of technology in life sciences research in the last 5 decades. With the rapid infusion of technology and change in culture, society, and legal practices, it is time to think deeply about the role of the discipline, its impact on our society, and the people who practice it. In today's episode, we shall discuss different aspects of bioethics, its need for our society, and some of the controversial topics related to abortion and medical paternalism with our guest, Rohin Bhatt. Rohin is an outgoing master's student in the bioethics program at Harvard University, Cambridge, in the United States. Rohin, welcome to the forum and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To begin with, can you tell our viewers what is the need of bioethics in today's world and who are the major players in terms of societies, individual nations, and institutions who are far ahead of others?
Right, so bioethics as a discipline seeks to look into the moral theories as they affect science. So, as a discipline, it has three major subdisciplines. The first is medical ethics, the second is animal ethics, and the third is environmental ethics. A lot of these topics often intersect and uh, overlap, and insofar as these topics are concerned as ethical, they affect every one of us, right? There is no major player in bioethics. Bioethics, as one of my favorite authors writes, is everybody's business. So something as small as an abortion affects every single one of us. Medical research affects every single one of us. Animal and environmental ethics affects every single one of us, because any changes in any one of these things is going to affect all of us. There are no major players. Everybody should be interested in bioethics, and it should not be, as it currently is, be the sole domain of either scientists or philosophers or lawyers.
Now, the second part of the question, what I meant by major players, is which are the institutions or the societies that, in your opinion, are far ahead in doing the ethical things in the research?
Right, so if you look at the broader players in the research these days, you have the US and the UK, Europe leading the way. But at the same time, that is not to say that they are far ahead in terms of doing ethical research. If you look at some of the studies that have come out of Europe recently, where scientists have created autistic monkeys to help understand autism in it, and every single person that I have talked to has told me they are not very sure if this thing is ethical. So to say that a country or a region is ahead in doing bioethics is, I think, a slightly tricky thing to say. However, what has happened is the way bioethics has evolved as a discipline academically, out of the civil rights movement and the feminist movement in the backdrop of the Second World War, where you had these Nazi trials going on in Germany. You find Europe and US leading the way.
Okay, I understand that, and we'll come to some of those countries and how they practice vis-a-vis India at a later point. And now let's just focus on the biological sciences research. And we know, as you mentioned, bioethics as a discipline actually hasn't evolved as we would like to in India, and we very much want to see that in the coming future. But can you tell us, if I am a researcher in life sciences, how am I supposed to make sure that I'm ethical in carrying out my work? And what are the current institutional and legal requirements to conduct biological sciences research in an ethical way?
Right. So it's complicated. Let me put it this way. There is a wide gamut of laws, regulations, guidelines that you will have to look at. But broadly speaking, if you were a life sciences researcher who was doing medical ethics research, you would have to look at the ICMR guidelines. But at the same time, there are various other guidelines that you would have to look into. You would have to look into the environmental laws, the animal protection laws. You would have to look at, laws around medical negligence insofar as they affect if your research affects human patients. So there's a wide range of things you have to look at. Insofar as what you have to do to be ethical, I would say as long as you stick to the four basic principles of ensuring non-maleficence to your patients, of ensuring beneficence to your patients, of ensuring justice in the way you conduct your research, and in ensuring that your patients' autonomy is respected insofar as they are able to give informed consent without coercion. If you follow these four principles, what are called the four principles of biomedical ethics, which were laid down by Beecham and Childress in their landmark book called Beecham and Childress's Biomedical Ethics, you should be fine. Now, the way these four principles have evolved has changed from time to time. The book is currently in its 8th edition, and I think as we move ahead, the way we look at these principles is also going to change. So the current understanding of these principles are they are co-equal principles, with no one principle gaining precedence over the other. We have had until before the 7th edition of the book was published, people arguing that bodily autonomy perhaps might trump the other three principles. But in the 8th edition, in the preface, they make it explicitly clear that all these four principles are equal.
Right.
So,
sorry, you continue.
So as long as your research ensures that you respect your research trial participants, as long as you respect these four principles, as long as you respect the fact that your research should be just not only in terms of who you recruit as trial participants, but also who gets the benefits of the research, as long as you ensure that not only are your patients not harmed, your research also benefits those patients. That could be very broadly and that's a very non-nuanced laced way of putting it.
Right. So, you talked about four principles. Now, the problem with these principles for a biological sciences researcher is that there is a huge cultural and religion angle to it. Because what may be just for you in one religion may not be looked similarly in another religion. And we'll just broaden the discussion based on that. Now, we know that in a contemporary scientific practice, religion should not have any role in both experimentation and interpretation of data. However, for some, and perhaps for many in our country, religion does act like a gateway to be ethical and moral, while they plan the experiments and analyze data. Now, what do you think, as bioethicist, should religion be involved or taken into consideration by making rules and expanding that further in the legal arena? Should law see religious practices before putting together a legal guidelines? In other words, what I'm asking, in other words, can one be good without God?
Right. That's easier said than done, answering that question. But let me put it in two parts. Part the first, let's talk about should religion interfere in science? And the second part, should religion interfere with the law? If I'm answering your first part, should religion enter science? No, it should not. But at the same time, to say that any scientist who conducts research should not be religious is problematic in its own self. People have a right to their beliefs, and these beliefs have often frame the moral background of a person and how he thinks about it. And so the way we are brought up in India or around the world kind of, and the landscapes that you see on this terrain are wide, they are diverse. Bioethics does not seek to answer a question saying this is just or this is good. What we do as bioethicists is to find a wide range of moral landscapes and terrains that are acceptable. That is, the quest for a single-handed objective truth or objective good, as it were, is impossible. Now, the way bioethics has evolved, it has found itself traditionally grounded in the Judeo-Christian religious framework and Western philosophy. For bioethics to evolve in India, we need to see more engagement coming from Indians, from Indian philosophers, from Indian religious scholars, from Indian lawyers to kind of engage with these issues intimately in academic spaces, in public fora, so that this develops. Now, the second part of your question, which dealt with religion and law.
I may interrupt you. We'll talk about the
Sure.
legal aspect in a second, but I think you're right absolutely that as far as the bioethics rules are concerned, in our society, we need to take care of the Eastern philosophy, Indian cultural tradition, Indian religious traditions, and most importantly, as you mentioned, involving the civil society as a whole. So before we make any law or before we make any rules or guidelines, very often then, not that we don't actually involve our civil society. Of course, it's easier said than done, but we need to do that often. Now, coming back to what we wanted to answer on the law. Now, expanding that, the discussion that we are having into law in a society like India, as you know, we are multicultural, multilinguistic, multi-religious, and there are many, many voices. Now, with this polyphony taking into account, our existing law and that governs experimentation and the data analysis, what is the best way out for the legal framework to be formed in India? Existing frameworks that exist in India, does it take into account these multi-religious, multicultural aspects into account when the law is made? And if it isn't, is that the right thing to do?
Right. So here's how I see it. I think ethics in itself is a very amorphous concept. To guide ethics into something tangible, into something that we can enforce, we need something like law to back it up. We are a polyphonous society, as you very rightly pointed out, right? If you look at just Hindu philosophy, what philosophy do we consider Hindu philosophy or Eastern philosophy? Should we consider only the Vedic philosophy, and in doing so, leave out the Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi voices and ignore the backdrop of casteism that we see? If we only consider something like, something that's very Indian in itself, it leads us to the very idea of India, which is, as of now, very, and has been throughout decades, a very hotly debated political, religious concept. So, that is why we need something like law, which is grounded in the Constitution, which is grounded in principles of equality that the Constitution provides for, which is grounded in a basic common uniting morality, as it were, in the morality of the Constitution is required. That we need to say that in our scientific spaces there is no place for casteism, there is no space for racism, there is no space for homophobia. These are the things that need to come out of law and our Constitution as they guide us, because as a diverse people who eat different foods, who worship different gods in the same God in different ways. We eat different foods. The Constitution is the only one thing that unites us. And so what we need is to kind of ground ourselves in the Constitution, to ground ourselves in the basic morality of the Constitution, and make sure that as we move ahead, you look at Constitution in itself as a bioethical document that affects lives, because Constitution to me has a lot of things that are bioethical in itself. The Constitution tells that there is a government duty to secure better health. The Constitution guides a duty of the government to protect environment. Article 21 of the Constitution says right to life, and in the reading of the right to life that we see given by the courts over the years, you see a wide gamut of rights: right not to live in, right to fresh air, clean water, right to food. So Constitution as a living and transformative document that grounds our common morality, to me is one of the foremost bioethical document that should guide us as Indian people involved either in just the academic pursuit of bioethics as I am, or as life sciences researchers. Uh, Having said that, there is a fair bit of good, great scholarship that has been around for 30 years. The Indian Journal of Medical Ethics has been around for nearly 30 years. You have a new journal coming out called Research and Humanities in Medical Education, which has been bringing forth some fantastic scholarship. There are master's courses coming up slowly and gradually, but there is not only a requirement for Indian academia from the life sciences, from the law, from religious studies, from philosophy, from veterinary sciences, from environmental sciences to kind of closely engage. And if they are to closely engage, the law must be a robust tool in navigating those relationships, because what has happened is we've seen with COVID how Bhopal gas tragedy survivors were put in a vaccine trial and told that they were getting medicines for COVID. We have seen babies left stateless after foreign parents came into India to get surrogacy done, and the baby left one baby behind, taking one baby with them.
So I'll stop you there, and I think I do agree that no sane person will disagree with this fact that as Indians, we should be looked everyone equally. No matter what their orientation says, no matter of what their background is, no matter where they come from, caste, creed, and religion, we need to look at them with one eye. Now, the basic question that I asked was, when the law is formed in our country, now, we know that the legal fraternity is not supposed to look at the religion angle, but in terms of bioethics laws or the laws that govern bioethics in India, do you think there is some consideration of our religious practices before making into any document into law?
Absolutely. I think if you look at, but there's a reason that law has somehow been left out of the way bioethics and religion intersect in India is because of this. If you look at the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, for example, which remains the most hotly debated issue here in the United States right now, religion has never kind of played a role in Indian abortion debates as it has here in the United States. And the reason for that, to my mind, has been that we as a society have been patriarchal in the way we wanted to abort female fetuses over the years. Which is why, to my mind, religion has not come at the center of our abortion debates. The idea was to get a male child.
Right. So I would stop you there, because that's essentially my next question. And let me just take a segue, because this is a bigger debate on a most important issue, that is abortion. Now, the important societal issue related to bioethics is obviously on abortion, and this is very timely, especially what is going on, as you mentioned, in the United States at present, and that can have ripple effects around the world. And I'm talking obviously about the Roe versus Wade judgment. Now, for our viewers, I would like to take a little bit of time and give them the background. Now, Roe versus Wade, a landmark judgment of the US Supreme Court that was passed in 1973, provided liberty to a woman to choose to have an abortion without government restriction and interference. Its genesis started when a woman with the pseudonym Jane Roe got pregnant with a third child and wanted to abort the child in 1969 in the state of Texas, where abortion was illegal except when it is necessary to save the mother's life. This led to a legal battle when Roe's attorneys filed a lawsuit on her behalf against the local district attorney Henry Wade, alleging that the abortion law in Texas was unconstitutional, and thus the name Roe versus Wade. Now, after nearly 5 decades, a leaked draft suggested that the US Supreme Court may overturn the Roe versus Wade ruling. This has far-reaching consequences, not just in the US, but in India and in the rest of the world. And the particular consequences can be on issues like abortion, future choice on marriage, gay rights, and other related issues. Now let's come to India. In India, abortion under the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971, with certain riders puts forward conditions like whether the opinion from one or two doctors are needed depending on the gestation period of 20 or 24 weeks, respectively, along with other conditions. Additionally, the Supreme Court recognized privacy as a fundamental right under the Constitution. And I'm referring to the privacy judgment as recent as 2012 in the Justice case Putuswamy versus Union of India case, which recognized women to make reproductive choice as a part of personal liberty. Now, with this background and the context that we are talking about right to privacy, fundamental rights, and reproductive right, where do we stand in India and how do you see India should be in the future years?
Right. I think there are two ways again I'll answer this. The first is the law governing pregnancy termination in India, that is the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act itself. And second, what should be the right of women? Now, if you look at the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act that governs abortion broadly, notwithstanding certain provisions in the IPC, which also talk about what happens when you cause miscarriage, you will find that both of these are talked about in terms of who can medically terminate the fetus, right? So the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act says that the doctor will not be punished if this and this happens, instead of placing the woman at the center of the debate in it. To my biggest gripe with the Indian law is this, that it is far more about who performs the abortion than who gets the abortion. And that should not be the case. A pregnant person should be at the center of these abortion debates rather than the person who's performing an abortion. Now that with Putuswamy and a long line of judgments before and after that, the Supreme Court, various high courts have recognized that there is a fundamental right of a woman to make decisions about her own body. But the problem also comes in the realization of these rights. It's all well and good for the nine male judges of the Supreme Court, to sit and say that a woman can do anything about that they want to do about with themselves, with their bodies. But does that right to privacy translate into some woman sitting in, thousands of kilometers away from the Supreme Court in Delhi in a rural place, or even urban centers for that matter, to get an abortion when she wants to? And the answer to that is no. So, while we talk about Roe versus Wade and how Roe versus Wade threatens a litany of rights that were read into the US Supreme Court by reading into the right to privacy into their constitution, I think we we need to talk about that, but at the same time we also need to talk about what's happening in our own country. Do our pregnant persons have a right to terminate their pregnancy and exercise their autonomy as they see fit? And I think the answer to that would, I think, be a no. And so what we need is far more inclusive sex education. You need far more accessibility of contraception that's available around the country. You need far more education levels. Education levels have shown that when women are educated, maternal health suddenly improves. When women are educated, the post-natal mortality also improves. The birth rates suddenly start increasing because children stop dying after birth immediately. So it's a very complex topic that has its issues not only with the law, but with the social determinants of health, with political determinants of health, with legal determinants of health, that all need to be addressed in a holistic way to kind of truly ensure that every pregnant person, irrespective of their gender, is able to make decisions about their body freely without coercion from any other parties. And the way people frame Roe's problems right now is that Roe is a woman's issue. Roe will lead to a breakdown of same-sex relationships. Roe will lead to a breakdown of the same-sex marriage as it now is. But Roe is a same-sex marriage issue. Roe is a queer rights issue because people who are engaged in same-sex relationships or in queer relationships also get pregnant. They also have their own bodily autonomy. Trans people have their own bodily autonomy and privacy rights, that of which Roe forms the foundational stone. So the moment Roe goes, all of these rights will fall. But at the same time, Roe is important to these people as well. Roe is important to queer couples, to you know, to interracial couples, because what goes next, perhaps, is some states have said that they will kind of have their own version of the love jihad laws as we have in India in terms of banning interracial marriages. So Roe is a problem for them.
Absolutely. I think it goes without saying, as I mentioned, it can have a ripple effects, because it is not about woman's body, it is about the body. And the body could belong to anyone, whether it's a same-sex couple or heterosexual couples or anyone, and even in case of surrogate mothers. Now, this leads to our last question, which is about female infanticides. Contrary to what many may believe, the preference for male child is so deeply ingrained in our society that cuts across caste, class, or socioeconomic status that is very troubling. Although the Parliament enacted the Prenatal Diagnostic Technique Regulation and Prevention of Misuse Act in 94, that got upgraded in 2003 to include a much larger prohibition on tests, advertisements, and technologies that prohibits prenatal or testing the gender of the fetus before birth, female infanticide remains very active in our country. There is no doubt that the act has reduced the rate of female infanticides. However, it's not perfect, and it has been criticized by many. For example, the act prohibits scanning in machines not to be transported out of the diagnostic centers, making other critical conditions or situations where they could be used, and there are no alternatives available. Now, in your opinion, given the scope of the law that can be improved, how should a perfect law look like?
That's a question that has been plaguing legal philosophers for centuries now. And I think, as somebody who's had like reasonably less training in law than perhaps most people who've been trying to figure out what perfect law should look like or how to define a perfect law, I don't think I am the right person to answer. Having said that, I think there is definitely a scope for reform, not only on the legislative side but also on the enforcement side. I think often when we have laws which are enacted with bona fide intentions, these laws often fail to take into account some of the most basic things, like you mentioned, transporting machines out of a diagnostic center. Our laws around the world, for some reason, have are not perfect, and they never will be. US, for example, has had this very strange law until Obama did away with it. It was that milk was oil for some reason under FDA guidelines. And so every time a farmer would have a milk spill, he would have to notify the FDA and use it as report it as an oil spill. So law as a tool has really fascinated me in that, it can never be perfect. It can always be reformed. It has to keep up. But at the same time, even in Prenatal Diagnostics Act, the pregnant person's rights are not at the center when they should have been. You do put the fetus at the center of it, but again, the whole act is kind of framed in a way that talks about the immunity of the person who performs these procedures. Our reproductive rights framework needs to place pregnant people at its center, which it does not currently. That is what is required not only in Indian framework, but in global frameworks as well. You find women consistently across the globe women and pregnant persons being moved away from the center of these debates, and fetus kind of gaining the center, or as is the case with India, the doctor performing this at the center of these debates. They should not be. Fetus, again, that is a debated issue, and I firmly believe that a woman's moral status trumps that of a fetus, and a woman's rights or a pregnant person's rights to their own body is absolute. But in a modern liberal democracy, the way I see it, penalizing a pregnant person for choices that they make about their body is problematic.
Absolutely. I think, Rohin, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time that we have today. I would like to thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.